Following Jesus is hard. Now, first things first. The good news first. God's grace comes first. And receiving that is easy. We don't have to do anything whatsoever to receive God's mercy, grace, and love. Following Jesus is not the way we earn God's love. But God's grace calls us to then follow Jesus, beckons us to then serve him. We do that in response to God's love. And that is indeed hard. Listen to the things Jesus says in the gospel today to people who want to follow him. You are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Let them deny themselves and take up their cross. Those who lose their life for my sake will find it. That's hard. In fact, it sounds like living a completely different life than most of us lead. At first glance, it sounds like we're called to leave this life behind and enter the monastery or convent. Deny yourself. Lose your life for my sake. Set your mind on divine things and not human things. Now that would change a lot in our lives, wouldn't it? We think about human things all the time. The bills we have to pay, taking care of our health, all our things, the stuff we own, our relationships. These are all human things. Setting our mind not on these things would be a big change. And not necessarily a welcome one. And what would be the divine things that we would think about? Prayer? Heaven? Church? Not much in our everyday life is divine, is it? Now we know better than that. Divine things are, by definition, things that belong to God. And we know what belongs to God. Can anybody tell me what on this earth belongs to God? Right. Everything, all of it, including our bills and our health and our things and our relationships and so forth. It all belongs to God, which means it's all divine things, really. All human things are divine things because everything belongs to God. So when Jesus tells Peter to set his mind on divine things rather than human things, I think his meaning is more subtle. I think it's not about what to think about, but rather how to think about things. I think he was telling Peter, you're not thinking in the divine way, but in the human way. And there is definitely a difference there. There's definitely a way to think about things in God's way. And to see it, we only need to look at Jesus. How did Jesus think about things? How did he think about taking up the cross? How did he think about obediently following God? How did he think about losing his life and finding it again? Now, I'm not saying that following Jesus means we all need to be killed as Jesus was. Very few people are called to be martyrs, just as very few are called to be monks or nuns. But we are all called to think about things in the divine way. For most of us, that means doing that in our ordinary life, thinking about the things of our ordinary life in the divine way. So what does this look like? What does thinking about the things of our ordinary life in the divine way look like? Well, it looks something, I think, like our second reading today. Our second reading from St. Paul's letter to the Romans could be described as Paul's tips on how to follow Christ. I'll read these tips again, but before I do, I want to give you 2 ground rules for them. Ground rule number 1, these are not tips on how to earn God's love. Like I said at the beginning of the sermon, we've already received God's love. It's here. It's with us. It's in us. These are things we do in response to God's love. As the author of 1 John wrote, we love because God first loved us. God won't love you any more for following these. These are gifts to us, not a test. And ground rule number 2, this whole thing is in the plural. That's easy to miss when we read it in English. But in the original Greek, it is all clearly plural. These are not individual guidelines for individual believers, but rather guidelines for a community. We are all in this together, and we can only follow these guidelines when we support one another. Okay, with those 2 ground rules in mind, let's hear it. Romans chapter 12, Paul's tips on how to follow Christ. One more thing. I'm going to read them in a different translation than before, a translation called The Message. Okay, Romans chapter 12. One more thing. While I'm reading this, I'd like you to do something. As I read each of these tips, I'd like you to raise your hand whenever you hear one that you find hard to do. My guess is that we'll all have our hands raised at one time or another. Maybe some of us will have our hands raised the entire time. And that's okay. And it's also okay to look around and see whose hand is raised. It's okay for us to admit to one another that it's hard to follow Jesus. And to admit that we're in it together. We have to be honest, and we have to be able to support one another. Okay, Romans chapter 12, from the Message translation, St. Paul's tips on how to follow Christ. Love from the center of who you are. Don't fake it. Run for dear life from evil. Hold on to dear life for good. Be good friends who love deeply. Practice playing second fiddle. Don't burn out. Keep yourselves fueled in a flame. Be alert servants of the Master, cheerfully expectant. Don't quit in hard times. Pray all the harder. Help needy Christians. Be inventive in hospitality. Bless your enemies. No cursing under your breath. Laugh with your happy friends when they're happy. Share tears when they're down. Get along with each other. Don't be stuck up. Make friends with nobodies. Don't be the great somebody. Don't hit back. Discover beauty in everyone. If you've got it in you, get along with everybody. Don't insist on getting even. That's not for you to do. I'll do the judging, says God. I'll take care of it. If you see your enemy hungry, go buy that person lunch. Or if he's thirsty, get him a drink. Your generosity will surprise him with goodness. Don't let evil get the best of you. Get the best of evil by doing good. Thank you for participating in this. This stuff is hard. And it's okay that it's hard. We're never going to get it perfect. None of us will. But together, we can try. We don't need to do this in order to receive God's love. But if we try, this will lead us closer to the abundant life that Christ offers for us right now. If we try, we might find that living this way is the abundant life that Christ promises. I've made copies of this for you to take home, and I'll pass them out during the hymn. Take these home. Put them somewhere to remind you, and try it. Talk to each other about how it's going. This is a gift from God to you. This is a way to set our mind on divine things in our everyday, ordinary lives. Amen.